Hey guys, tonight we're pouring something a little stronger than usual. The strange, sticky and gloriously misguided birth of the modern cocktail. We are travelling back to an era when the United States government looked at an entire nation of people who loved a quiet drink after work and said, "You know what would solve everyone's problems? Banning it completely." What followed was 13 years of secret bars, bathtub gin, and some of the most creative law-breaking in human history. And somewhere in all that chaos, almost entirely by accident, the cocktail as we know it was born. Before we begin, a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. I love that you sent this in, and honestly, half of what we cover here comes straight from your ideas, so please keep them coming. If you enjoy these late-night wanders through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure at all. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because it is always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, fluff your pillow, and settle in. But before you drift off, let yourself wonder a few things. Have you ever wondered what you would actually do if the government made your Friday glass of wine a federal crime? Could you tell the difference between real gin and something a stranger brewed in a tub next to his laundry? Would you know the secret password to get into the bar hidden behind the flower shop? Or would you just stand in the alley looking suspicious until someone called the police? And when the only booze available tasted like paint thinner and regret, would you have been clever enough to hide it under a splash of citrus, a spoon of honey, and a fancy name? Well, tonight you get to find out. Because congratulations, you have just woken up in 1920 on the very morning that America went completely dry, and nobody, not the lawmakers, not the preachers, not you, has the faintest idea what is about to happen. It is the evening of January 16th, 1920, and you are standing in your favourite saloon holding what everyone in the room knows is the last legal drink of your life. At the stroke of midnight, the whole country goes dry, and the bartender who has poured your beer for a decade keeps glancing at the clock like it personally betrayed him. Some patrons are weeping into their whiskey, others are staging mock funerals, complete with black armbands and a coffin paraded solemnly down the street. You raise your glass one final time, not entirely sure whether you're mourning a drink or an entire way of life. Spoiler, it is both. The mood in the room is somewhere between a wedding and a wake, which is a difficult thing to pull off, yet here everyone is, managing it beautifully. A man at the end of the bar has ordered 6 drinks at once and lined them up like little soldiers, determined to send them all off personally before the deadline. He will not succeed. He will, however, try with a dedication you cannot help but admire. Outside, in the cold January dark, the mood is stranger still. In some cities there are genuine funeral processions, with mourners in black following a coffin that contains, depending on the town, a bottle of whiskey, a cask of beer, or a sign reading simply, "Goodbye, old friend." Bands play slow dirges. Grown adults dab at their eyes over the impending loss of the corner tavern. It is theatrical, it is absurd, and it is completely sincere, which is the most absurd part of all. You should understand that this is not really about one drink. The saloon behind you is not merely a place that sells alcohol. It is where you cashed your paycheck, where you heard about the job opening, where you ate the free lunch that came with a 5-cent beer, where you argued about politics and baseball and whose turn it was to buy the next round. When they lock these doors at midnight, they are not just closing a bar. They're closing the town's living room, and everybody in it feels the draft already. The clock, meanwhile, does what clocks do. It advances with complete indifference to your feelings, which is frankly rude given the occasion. Someone starts a countdown, the way you might on New Year's, except instead of welcoming something, you're shoving it out the door and locking it behind. 10, 9, 8. The bartender pours the very last legal ounces he will ever pour in this establishment, his hands moving with the practiced sadness of a man performing his own retirement, and then it is midnight, and it is over. The taps go silent. The bottles that remain become, in a single tick of the clock, contraband. What was a respectable business at 11:59 is a criminal enterprise at 12 o'clock, and nothing physical has changed at all. The same liquid sits in the same glass on the same scarred wooden bar. Only the law has moved, and it has moved with all the grace of a drunk stumbling into furniture. You finish your drink. It tastes, if you are honest, exactly like every other drink you have had here, which is to say, ordinary and a little flat and utterly precious now that it is the last one. You set the empty glass down. Somewhere a lawmaker is congratulating himself on solving the nation's problems forever. He has in fact just created several thousand new ones, and you're about to live through every single one of them. Let us talk about the thing that ruined everyone's evening, the Volstead Act. On paper, the country agreed to ban intoxicating liquor, which sounds simple enough until you read the fine print and discover that intoxicating was defined as anything above 0.5% alcohol. That is roughly the strength of aggressive fruit juice. Congress had essentially outlawed everything fun and left the details to a man named Andrew Volstead, who was not exactly the life of the party. But here is the delicious wrinkle nobody mentions. The law banned making and selling booze, while drinking it stayed perfectly legal, which meant the government had accidentally written the most confusing rulebook in the nation's history. Sit with that contradiction for a moment, because it is the crack through which this entire era climbs. It is against the law to produce alcohol. It is against the law to sell alcohol. It is against the law to transport alcohol. But it is entirely, cheerfully legal to drink it. The government has told you that you may have the thing, but under no circumstances may you obtain the thing. It is like being told you're welcome to keep a pet elephant, provided you never buy one, breed one, or move one across the street. The number itself is a small comedy, 0.5%. To grasp how low that is, understand that ordinary bread sitting innocently in your kitchen can produce trace amounts of alcohol as it ferments. Certain fruit juices left a little too long will drift past the legal limit on their own initiative. The lawmakers had drawn their line so close to zero that nature itself was technically in violation, which tells you something about how carefully the whole thing had been thought through. Andrew Volstead, whose name is now permanently attached to the mess, was a quiet congressman from Minnesota who was not even the true architect of the idea. He simply sponsored the bill and thereby earned an immortality he probably would have declined if asked. For the rest of history, his name would be shorthand for the most unpopular law in the country. Imagine your surname becoming a synonym for taking away everyone's drinks. That is the legacy, and there is no returning it. The genius of ordinary people, however, is that they read a rulebook not for what it forbids, but for what it forgets, and this rulebook forgot a great deal, since drinking remained legal, and since possessing liquor bought beforehand remained legal. A whole nation of amateur lawyers suddenly appeared, squinting at the text and finding daylight in every clause. If you cannot sell it, but I can drink it, then technically, and technically is the magic word of this decade, we simply need to be creative about the space in between. You start to notice that a law is only as strong as the willingness of people to obey it, and the willingness here is roughly zero. The saloon keeper does not suddenly develop respect for a rule that just destroyed his livelihood. The farmer with a cellar of homemade wine does not pour it down the drain out of civic pride. The tired worker who liked a beer after a long shift does not decide that the beer was the real enemy all along. They all simply look at this confused, contradictory, barely readable law, and they all quietly arrive at the same conclusion. The conclusion is this: the government has made a rule it cannot possibly enforce against a desire it cannot possibly erase, using a definition that outlaws fruit juice. And so, rather than obey it, the entire country decides, more or less politely, to spend the next 13 years finding ways around it. The great national game has begun, and nobody has read the rules, because the rules do not really matter. Clever people saw this coming. In the months before the ban took effect, anyone with money and a basement went on a shopping spree that would make a doomsday prepper blush. You watch your wealthier neighbours haul home crate after crate of wine, whiskey and gin, filling cellars, closets, and in one memorable case an entire disused well. The law had a loophole you could drive a delivery truck through. Liquor bought before Prohibition and kept in your own home for your own use remained completely legal. So the rich toasted the new law from behind walls of legally hoarded champagne, while you stared sadly at the 2 dusty bottles you had managed to afford. The timing of this loophole is what makes it so exquisitely unfair. The ban was not sprung on the country overnight. It was announced well in advance, like a slow-moving storm, which gave everyone plenty of warning to prepare. And preparation, it turns out, requires money, which means the people best equipped to survive the drought were precisely the people who could most easily have gone without. You see it play out on your own street. The comfortable family in the large house spends the final legal months treating the liquor store like a going-out-of-business sale, which in a sense it is. Deliveries arrive in a steady parade. Men carry boxes down into the cellar and come back up empty-handed and go down again, over and over, until you begin to wonder whether they are building a house down there out of bottles. The truly wealthy take it further, because the truly wealthy always take it further. Private clubs quietly transfer their entire cellars into member-owned storage so the collection stays legal. One famous club in New York reportedly moved its stock to a warehouse and kept its members supplied for years, all perfectly within the rules, because the rules had a hole shaped exactly like a rich man's wine collection. It is amazing how accommodating the law becomes when you can afford to read it carefully. Meanwhile, you do your best with what you have. Perhaps you buy an extra bottle or 2, tucking them behind the flour in the pantry, rationing them out for special occasions and then for slightly less special occasions, and eventually for any Tuesday that seems to be dragging. Your stockpile is not a cellar. It is a small, sad shelf, and you find yourself dusting it with the tenderness usually reserved for family photographs. The lesson lands quietly, but lands hard. Prohibition was sold as a great equalizer, a law that would lift up the poor by saving them from the temptations of drink. In practice, it did something close to the opposite. The rich barely felt it, cushioned by their legal mountains of pre-purchased luxury. It was the ordinary worker, the one without a cellar or a spare fortune, who actually lost the corner saloon and the simple, affordable pleasure it offered. And so, a strange new class system forms around alcohol. There are those who prepared, sipping legally and smugly from their private reserves, and those who did not, forced out into the dangerous new world of bootleggers and bathtub gin to find a drink at all. The stockpile is the first great irony of the era, though it will have plenty of company before we are through. A law meant to close the gap between rich and poor has, on its very first day, quietly widened it, and nobody in the big house with the full cellar seems especially bothered. The saloon was more than a bar. It was your post office, your job board, your union hall, your free lunch counter, and the only place warm enough to sit in January without paying rent. And now it is gone, its doors chained, its long wooden bar sold for scrap or hauled off to become someone's garden bench. You wander past the empty windows feeling the peculiar grief of a person who has lost a second living room. The men who ran these places do not simply vanish, though. They are already whispering, already scheming, already eyeing the back rooms and basements where the whole thing is about to begin again, only quieter. To really mourn the saloon, you have to understand what it actually did, which was almost everything. If you were new in town and needed work, you did not check a website, because there was no website and would not be for the better part of a century. You went to the saloon, where the bartender knew who was hiring, and the men at the bar knew who had just quit. The place ran on information as much as on beer. Then there was the free lunch, one of the great small institutions of the age. For the price of a single cheap beer, you were entitled to help yourself to a spread of bread, cold meats, pickles, and salty things designed, admittedly, to make you thirsty enough to buy a second beer. For a labourer counting every coin, this was not a gimmick. It was lunch, a genuine and reliable meal, and its disappearance left a hole in more than one stomach. The saloon was also, crucially, warm. In a city winter, when your apartment was a cold water flat with the stingy landlord, the saloon offered heat, light, and a chair, all for the modest cost of a drink you were going to want anyway. It asked nothing of you but your company. You could sit for an hour nursing one beer and no one would move you along, because moving you along was not the point. The point was that you had somewhere to be. Now imagine all of that vanishing on a single winter night. The chained doors are not just keeping you from a drink. They're keeping you from the warmth, the food, the news, the company, the whole quiet machinery of ordinary working life. It is like flossing with pine needles. Technically, the law has removed a vice, but it has done so in the most painful and clumsy way imaginable, tearing out a dozen useful things along with the one it disapproved of. You watch the physical dismantling with a strange ache. The long mahogany bar, polished by decades of elbows, is pried loose and carried out. The brass rail where you rested your foot goes to a scrap dealer. The mirror that reflected 10,000 conversations is wrapped and sold. A thing that felt permanent, that felt like furniture in the life of the whole neighbourhood, is revealed to be just wood and glass after all, and off it goes. But here is the part the lawmakers did not count on. You cannot chain a habit. You can chain a door, but the men who ran the saloon are not sentimental about doors. They are practical people who have just watched their entire livelihood declared illegal, and they have families to feed and skills that do not translate to any other trade. They know their customers. They know the demand has not gone anywhere. And they are already looking at that empty back room with a certain gleam in the eye. The saloon is dead. Long live whatever it is about to become, down in the dark, behind a locked door, waiting for a knock. If they will not let you drink in the light, you will drink in the dark. Almost overnight, hidden bars begin sprouting behind bookshops, beneath restaurants, above garages, and inside apartments that suddenly have a suspicious number of visitors. They call them speakeasies, because you're meant to speak easy, meaning quietly, so the neighbours and the police do not catch on. In New York City alone, the number of these secret joints will eventually dwarf the number of legal bars that existed before the ban. You have not lost your nightlife. You have simply been handed a treasure hunt, and the prize at the end is a drink. The name itself tells you everything about the etiquette. Speakeasy. Keep your voice down. Do not stand outside announcing your business to the street. The whole enterprise depends on a kind of shared quiet, a citywide agreement to pretend that nothing is happening in the very places where quite a lot is happening. It is a conspiracy in which half the population is a member and the other half is politely looking the other way. What amazes you is the sheer variety of hiding places. A speakeasy can be anywhere, because anywhere is exactly where the authorities are not looking. There are grand ones, plush with velvet and chandeliers, where the wealthy sip cocktails as though the law were a rumour from another country. And there are miserable ones, little more than a dim room with a plank across two barrels, where the clientele drinks fast and does not ask questions. The city hides its thirst at every level of comfort. The ordinary businesses out front become elaborate disguises. A flower shop that seems to sell very few flowers. A bookstore whose customers rarely leave carrying books. A restaurant with a modest dining room and a back room 3 times its size, roaring with a crowd that never seems to order any food. You learn to read a street differently, to notice which quiet little shops have a strange amount of foot traffic after dark, because the boring facade is often the door to the interesting truth. The numbers, when you hear them, are frankly ridiculous. Before the ban, a city might have counted its legal saloons in the thousands. After the ban, the same city counts its illegal speakeasies in numbers that make the old total look modest. The law aimed to reduce the number of places to drink to 0, and instead it multiplied them. It is the sort of result that should have prompted someone in charge to sit down quietly and reconsider the whole plan. No one did. There is a peculiar thrill to it all that the old saloon never had. The legal bar was convenient and open and dull in the way that legal things often are. The speakeasy is inconvenient, hidden, and slightly dangerous, and it turns out that a great many people rather enjoy that. Getting a drink is no longer a simple errand. It is an adventure with a locked door at the start of it, and adventures, even small ones, have a way of making people feel alive. You begin to build a mental map of the city's secret life, a private geography known only to those in on it. This unmarked door leads somewhere good. That basement is worth the trouble. The place behind the laundry is fine, but waters down the gin. This knowledge is currency now, traded in whispers between friends who trust each other, a quiet network of the thirsty helping the thirsty. The saloon died in the light. The speakeasy is being born in the dark, and it is being born everywhere at once. You just have to know where to knock. Getting into a speakeasy is its own little theatre of the absurd. You approach an unmarked door, knock in some agreed rhythm and wait as a small panel slides open and a pair of deeply unimpressed eyes examines you. You mutter the password, which might be something dignified or might be the phrase "Joe sent me," and if the eyes approve, the door swings open into another world entirely. If they do not approve, you are left standing in an alley feeling like you failed a test you did not study for. It is exclusive, it is ridiculous, and it is the single most exciting thing that has ever happened to your Tuesday. The peephole is the heart of the whole ritual, a small sliding hatch set into a heavy door, and behind it lives a man whose entire job is judgment. He's seen every kind of person try to talk their way inside, and he has developed the flat, patient stare of someone who cannot be fooled and knows it. You could be the mayor himself, and that stare would not soften until you produce the right words. It is the most powerful little window in the city. The passwords themselves range from the clever to the gloriously stupid. Some establishments favour a genuine secret phrase, changed regularly to stay ahead of the authorities. Others rely on the simple magic of a name, the idea being that if you know that a fellow called Joe sends people here, you're probably not a police officer, or at least not a very good one. The security is not exactly rigorous. It relies mostly on the fact that the truly clueless will not even know to knock. There is a whole choreography to your approach, and you learn it quickly because everybody learns it quickly. You do not loiter in front of the door because loitering draws eyes. You do not arrive in a large loud group because large loud groups draw eyes. You walk up as though you belong. You give the knock. You say the words in a voice pitched low, and you slip inside the instant the door allows it. Grace under a peephole is a genuine social skill in this decade. And oh, the failures. There is no humiliation quite like giving the wrong password to an unimpressed doorman and watching that little panel slide shut in your face with a soft, final click. You stand there in the alley, replaying your mistake, wondering if you got the phrase wrong or the knock wrong or simply the vibe wrong. Somewhere on the other side of that door a party is happening, and you are not at it, and there is nothing to do but shuffle away and hope the next place has lower standards. The genius of the system is that it makes everyone inside feel chosen. You did not simply walk into a bar. You knew the door, you knew the knock, you knew the words, and you passed the silent judgment of the man at the peephole. By the time you descend the stairs into the noise and the light, you feel less like a customer and more like a member of a secret society, which is precisely the feeling the whole performance is designed to create. Of course, it is also mostly theatre, and everyone quietly knows it. If a raid comes, the password will not save the place, and the unimpressed man at the peephole will be arrested right alongside the customers he so carefully screened. The security is thin, more ceremony than defence, but the ceremony matters. It transforms an illegal drink in a basement into an experience, an event, a story you will tell tomorrow. You give the knock. The panel slides open. The eyes find you and weigh you, and you speak, very easy, the words that turn a locked door into an open one. Somebody has to make all this illegal booze, and increasingly that somebody is an amateur with a bathtub and no fear of consequences. The recipe is alarmingly simple. Take industrial or grain alcohol, cut it with water, add a splash of juniper oil or glycerin and pray. They call it bathtub gin, not because it is brewed in the tub, but because the bottles are too tall to fill under a normal sink tap, so people top them off in the bathtub instead. It is cloudy, it is harsh, and it occasionally makes people go blind, but it is alcohol, and in 1922 that appears to be all the quality control anyone requires. Let us clear up the name first, because everyone gets it wrong and the truth is funnier. The gin is not fermented in the bathtub like some horrible soup. The base spirit is made or acquired elsewhere and then flavoured in bottles, and those bottles are simply too tall to fit under the average kitchen faucet when it comes time to add water. So the maker carries them to the bathroom and tops them up at the tub tap instead. The bathtub is not the brewery. It is just the only tap tall enough. The process, such as it is, would give a real distiller nightmares. Genuine gin is a careful thing, distilled and redistilled, its botanicals balanced by people who know what they're doing. Bathtub gin skips all of that. You take a neutral alcohol of dubious origin. You dump in juniper oil to approximate that piney gin flavour, perhaps some glycerin to give it body, a bit of water to make it survivable, and you shake it up and call it a product. 'Tis to real gin what a stick figure is to a portrait. The results are, to put it kindly, inconsistent. One batch might be merely unpleasant, a harsh, oily liquid that scrapes down your throat like it holds a grudge. The next batch, made by the same hopeful amateur, might be genuinely dangerous. There is no measuring, No testing, no standard beyond the maker's optimism. Drinking it is a small act of faith each time, a bet that this particular bottle came out closer to beverage than to poison. And sometimes you lose that bet in the worst possible way. The great hidden danger is that industrial alcohol often contains methanol, a chemical cousin of drinking alcohol that the human body treats very differently. Where ordinary alcohol makes you drunk, methanol can make you blind or worse. The amateur bootlegger, working without knowledge or equipment, cannot reliably tell one from the other, which means some of these cheerful bathtub concoctions carry a genuinely lethal passenger. You would think this would frighten people away, and for some it does. But thirst and habit are powerful things, and the market for a cheap drink does not evaporate just because the drink is risky. So people take their chances. They buy from a maker they trust, or one they hope they can trust, and they tell themselves that this batch is surely fine, and they mostly get away with it, right up until the moment somebody does not. The whole grim enterprise is a monument to what happens when you ban a thing that people still want. The professionals who once made alcohol safely, under regulation and inspection, have been outlawed. In their place rises an army of untrained amateurs working in kitchens and bathrooms, answerable to no one, testing their product on their own customers. The law did not remove the alcohol. It simply removed everyone who knew how to make it without hurting anybody. And so you sip your cloudy, throat-searing bathtub gin, and you understand with total clarity why the next great problem is going to be figuring out how to make this stuff taste like anything but what it is. Here is the crisis at the very heart of our story. The booze is terrible, genuinely, offensively terrible. The smooth-aged whiskey and clean gin of the old days are gone, replaced by rushed, raw, chemically suspicious liquor that tastes like a campfire licked a battery. Drinking it straight is a form of self-punishment, and this, believe it or not, is the exact moment the modern cocktail is quietly conceived. Not in a fancy hotel or a chemist's laboratory, but in the desperate mind of every ordinary person staring at a glass of something awful and thinking, there simply has to be a way to make this not taste like this. To appreciate the horror, you have to remember what has been lost. Good liquor takes time. Whiskey mellows for years in wooden barrels, sanding down its rough edges into something smooth and warm. Gin is distilled with patience and care. All of that requires exactly the thing the bootlegger does not have, which is time, along with the freedom to work in the open. Aging a spirit for years is not an option when your still might be raided next Tuesday. So the bootlegger does the only thing he can. He rushes. He produces harsh young spirit and sells it immediately. No aging, no mellowing, no smoothing of edges. The result is a drink that has all the character of paint stripper and roughly the same effect on your throat. Ever tried to swallow something that fights back on the way down? That is your evening now. That is your only option. And straight liquor has become an act of grim endurance rather than any kind of pleasure. You take a sip and your whole face rebels. The flavour is not merely strong, it is wrong, chemical, aggressive, carrying notes of things that should never be near a beverage. It tastes the way a hardware store smells. And yet, this is what is available. This is what your money buys. So you are faced with the simple and pressing problem that millions of your fellow citizens are pondering at this exact moment across the country. The problem is this: how do you drink something that actively does not want to be drunk? How do you get the pleasant part, the warmth, the relaxation, the little social glow, without the punishing part, the taste that makes your eyes water and your throat file a formal complaint. It is a question of pure practical desperation. And desperation, as we keep learning in this story, is a remarkably reliable inventor. And here is the beautiful thing. This is not a problem being solved by experts in some grand institution. There is no committee, no laboratory, no distinguished panel of chemists. The people wrestling with this question are ordinary. They are the amateur host with a bottle of something dreadful and a party to throw. They are the speakeasy bartender working with whatever cloudy liquid the supplier delivered. They are you, standing in your own kitchen, glaring at a glass and thinking hard. What makes this the true heart of our story is that the answer, when it comes, will not just make the bad booze bearable, it will accidentally create something wonderful. The techniques people invent to hide the awfulness, the juices and sweeteners and bitters and careful balancing, will turn out to be the foundation of an entire art form. They are trying to solve an ugly problem, and they will stumble into beauty. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. For now you simply have your glass of something terrible, your face still recovering from the last sip, and a growing determination that there has to be a better way. There is. You're about to invent it, more or less by accident, along with a whole thirsty nation, and none of you will realize what you've done until long after it is done. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and nothing inspires invention quite like a mouthful of bad gin. The solution turns out to be beautifully obvious. Bury the flavor. You start adding things, whatever you can find: fruit juice, sugar, honey, soda, bitters, cream, anything sweet or sour or strong enough to wrestle the harshness into submission. What began as a cover-up slowly becomes an art form. The bee's knees, for instance, is nothing more than rough gin drowned in honey and lemon, and its very name was period slang for something excellent. You're no longer hiding rock gut. You're inventing a menu. The logic is not complicated, which is exactly why it works. If the liquor tastes bad, you introduce other flavors loud enough to shout it down. Something sweet to smother the harshness. Something sour to distract the tongue. Something aromatic to fill your nose with anything other than the smell of the spirit itself. Pile enough of these on top of the offending booze, and remarkably, the offending booze more or less disappears beneath them. Citrus becomes the great hero of this project. Lemon and lime are sharp and bright and assertive, and they do a magnificent job of masking the rough edges of a bad spirit. A generous squeeze of lemon can transform a cringe into something almost pleasant. It is like flossing with pine needles versus flossing with actual floss. The raw ingredient was punishment, but the right addition turns the whole experience into something you might voluntarily repeat. Sweetness does the other half of the work. Honey, sugar, syrup, whatever is on hand, softens the assault and rounds off the corners. The bee's knees is the perfect little monument to this idea, and its name is the joke made obvious. In the slang of the day, calling something the bee's knees meant it was the finest thing around. So here is a drink named Excellent, whose entire secret purpose is to make something distinctly not excellent taste like it might be. The name is a tiny act of marketing genius wrapped around a cover-up. What fascinates you as you experiment at your own kitchen table is how quickly the cover-up stops feeling like a cover-up. You add the lemon because you must. You add the honey because you must. But then you notice that this particular combination is actually rather nice, that the proportions matter, that a little more sour and a little less sweet makes a real difference. You have crossed a line without noticing it. You're no longer just hiding a flaw. You're chasing a flavor. This is the quiet miracle at the center of the whole era. A generation of people who never thought about mixing drinks are suddenly, out of pure necessity, becoming amateur mixologists. They are learning that a drink is a balance, a conversation between sweet and sour and strong and aromatic. They think they are simply making bad gin drinkable. They are actually rediscovering and expanding an entire craft, one desperate experiment at a time, and the menu grows. Once you understand the basic trick, the variations are endless. Swap the honey for sugar and you have one drink. Add soda and you have another. Introduce a dash of bitters, and suddenly there is depth where before there was only harshness. Each speakeasy, each host, each bartender develops their own little repertoire, their own signature ways of taming the untamable. Invention breeds invention. You look down at your glass, now golden with honey and bright with lemon, and you realize you would happily drink this even if the gin were good. That, right there, is the accidental birth of something lasting. You set out to disguise a terrible drink, and somewhere along the way you made a genuinely wonderful one. You just have not stopped to notice yet. Not everyone stays to brew poison in a basement. The great bartenders of America, the true artists who spent years learning to balance a drink, take one look at Prohibition and decide the whole country has lost its mind. So they leave. They pack their shakers and their little notebooks of recipes, and they sail for anywhere that will still let them work. London, Paris, Havana. One of them, a man named Harry Craddock, lands at a grand hotel in London and poured what he claims is the very last legal cocktail served in America before catching his boat. Their loss becomes the world's gain, and the American cocktail quietly goes international. Consider the position these people are in. They are craftsmen at the top of a real and demanding trade. A skilled bartender of this era is part chemist, part performer, part therapist, a person who has spent years learning exactly how much of this balances, exactly how much of that, and then, in a single night, their entire profession is declared a crime. All that skill suddenly worth nothing in their own country. It is like being a master carpenter in a nation that has just outlawed wood. Some of them stay and go underground, of course, plying their craft in the speakeasies. But the best and the proudest look at the situation clearly. Why hide in a basement, serving cloudy bathtub gin under threat of arrest, when the rest of the world is still perfectly happy to let you do your job in the open? Their talent is a passport, so they use it. Boarding ships bound for cities where a well-made cocktail is still a respectable thing to serve. They scatter across the globe, and everywhere they land they bring the American cocktail with them. In the grand hotels of London, in the cafes of Paris, in the sun-drenched bars of Havana, these exiles set up their shakers and get back to work. The locals, delighted, get a first-hand education in the American art of mixed drinks, taught by the very masters who perfected it. What America has thrown away, the world eagerly picks up. Harry Craddock becomes the great symbol of this migration. An accomplished bartender who leaves the United States and takes up residence at a famous London hotel, he carries the story that he served the last legal cocktail in America before departing. A nice piece of theatre, whether or not it is literally true. In London he flourishes, becomes a legend, and eventually gathers his knowledge into a book of recipes that drinkers still consult a century later. The country that exiled him gave the world one of its greatest cocktail authorities. There is a bitter comedy in it. Prohibition was meant to purify America, to rid it of the corrupting influence of drink. Instead, one of its first real achievements was to take the nation's finest drink makers and generously distribute them to every other country on earth. America did not stop the cocktail. It simply gift-wrapped its best practitioners and mailed them abroad, spreading the craft further and faster than any amount of ordinary business ever could. And the exiles do not just preserve what they knew. In their new homes, working with better ingredients and greater freedom, they refine and expand it. The cocktail grows up overseas during the very years it is outlawed at home. Recipes are polished, new drinks are invented, standards are raised, all in the bars of cities that never banned a thing. When the American drought finally ends, the cocktail that returns will be more sophisticated than the one that left. You picture one of them standing at the rail of a departing ship, shaker packed away, watching the American coast shrink into the distance. He's not fleeing in shame. He's carrying a craft to people who still want it. His country has told him his life's work is a crime. The rest of the world is about to tell him it is not. He knows which verdict he prefers, and he is sailing straight toward it. If you have money and a taste for freedom, you do not fight prohibition, you sail around it. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida sits Cuba, gloriously, unapologetically wet, and American tourists begin pouring into Havana like the tide. The rum flows, the sun shines, and the local bartenders, many of them freshly arrived from the States, are only too happy to serve you a cold daiquiri under a palm tree. An entire tourism industry blooms almost overnight, built on the simple promise that here at least a drink is not a crime. You return home tanned, relaxed, and carrying recipes nobody back home has even tasted yet. The geography is almost cruel in how convenient it is. 90 miles is nothing, a short hop by boat or plane, close enough that a person could conceivably leave a dry American city in the morning and be holding a legal drink on a Havana terrace by the afternoon. The forbidden thing is not hidden away on the far side of the world. It is right there, just over the water, waving at you from across a narrow strip of sea. So you go, along with a great flood of your fellow citizens. The steamships fill with thirsty Americans pointed south, and Havana opens its arms to receive them and their wallets. The city becomes a kind of pressure valve for the whole dry nation, a place where all the drinking that cannot happen at home happens instead, out in the open, in the sunshine, with a live band playing and nobody watching the door for police. The Cuban bartenders are exceptional, and they get better still as the exiled American masters arrive to join them. Together they turn the local rum into an art. The daiquiri, a simple, perfect marriage of rum, lime and sugar, becomes the drink of the moment, cold and bright and impossibly refreshing in the tropical heat. You order one and then another, marvelling that something this good is not merely permitted but positively encouraged. It is like flossing with pine needles at home and then discovering a place where they hand you real floss with a smile. The contrast between your two lives is almost dizzying. At home, you skulk into basements to drink cloudy gin from a coffee cup, glancing nervously at the door. Here, you lounge on a sunlit terrace while a smiling bartender presents a beautifully made cocktail on a tray. Same person, same thirst. Two completely different worlds separated by 90 miles of water. The trip does something to you beyond the pleasant sunburn. It shows you, in the clearest possible terms, how strange your own country's situation has become. Everywhere else, a drink is just a drink, an ordinary civilized pleasure. Only back home has it been transformed into contraband. Travel has a way of revealing the oddness of the rules you took for granted, and few rules look odder from a Havana beach than the one waiting for you at home, and you bring things back with you, things more durable than a tan. You bring the memory of the daiquiri, the knowledge of how rum can be handled, the taste of drinks your friends have never even heard of. Havana becomes a kind of laboratory in a classroom, sending its lessons north in the memories of returning tourists. The cocktail knowledge accumulating on that island seeps steadily back into the dry country, one vacationer at a time. You step off the return boat back into the land of passwords and peepholes, and the drought closes around you again. But something has shifted. You have seen the alternative. You know exactly what you are missing, and you know it is only 90 miles away, glinting in the sun, waiting for your next escape. Since the public bar is now illegal, the private home becomes the new frontier of drinking, and with it arrives something genuinely new, the cocktail party. You invite a few trusted friends over, mix up a pitcher of something citrusy enough to disguise your questionable gin, and suddenly entertaining has a whole fresh ritual. Hosts compete to serve the cleverest concoctions. Guests learn to hold a coupe glass and pretend they always have. What was once the domain of professional bartenders migrates straight into ordinary homes, and a whole generation quietly teaches itself to mix. The cocktail is no longer something you order. It is something you make. Think about how big a change this really is. Before the ban, drinking was something you went out to do. You left the house, you went to the saloon, a professional poured for you, and you came home. The home was where you slept and ate, not where you drank. Prohibition, by closing every legal public bar, quietly moved the entire enterprise indoors and dropped it right in your living room, where you now have to figure out what on earth to do with it. What you do with it, as it turns out, is throw a party. The cocktail party is a genuinely new invention of this era, and it solves several problems at once. It is private, which means it is safe from prying eyes. It is social, which restores some of the community the shuttered saloon took away. And it is intimate, limited to people you actually trust, which matters enormously when the thing you are all doing together is technically a crime. The host becomes the new bartender, and this is where the great amateur education really accelerates. You cannot rely on a professional anymore. If you want to serve a good drink in your own home, you have to learn to make one yourself, so you practice. You experiment with proportions. You test your recipes on willing friends. You slowly develop a small repertoire of things you can produce with confidence. A whole generation of ordinary people becomes, out of social necessity, genuinely skilled at mixing. And naturally it becomes competitive, because humans cannot leave any pleasant thing alone without turning it into a contest. Hosts begin to take quiet pride in their signature drinks. One friend makes a superb sour. Another has a way with a gin fizz that everyone secretly envies. You start to feel the pressure to have your own specialty, something you can present with a flourish when the guests arrive. Entertaining has acquired a new and demanding standard, and everyone is rising to meet it. The little rituals multiply and everyone plays along. You learn to hold the delicate coupe glass by its stem so your hand does not warm the drink. You learn to admire a well-made cocktail before you taste it. Guests who 6 months ago had never touched a cocktail now nod knowingly about balance and garnish, performing an expertise they are frantically acquiring on the spot. Everyone is pretending slightly and everyone is genuinely learning, and the two are impossible to separate. There is something quietly rebellious in all of it too. Every cocktail party is a small act of defiance, a room full of respectable people cheerfully ignoring a law they never respected in the first place. But it does not feel like crime. It feels like hospitality, like friendship, like a good evening among people you trust. The law wanted to make drinking shameful. Instead, it made it homey. You look around your living room at your friends, glasses in hand, laughing, and you realize the saloon did not really die. It simply moved into your house, put on nicer clothes, and learned some manners. Here is a twist the temperance crusaders never saw coming. The old saloon was a rough, sawdust-floored fortress of masculinity where a respectable woman would never be seen. But the speakeasy, being new, illegal and desperate for paying customers, throws its doors open to absolutely everyone. For the first time, you see women drinking openly alongside men, in public, without scandal, because the whole place is a scandal already. Prohibition, a law pushed hard by women's groups to protect the home, accidentally does more to bring women into nightlife than anything before it. The irony is thick enough to garnish a drink with. To understand how large this shift is, you have to picture the old saloon honestly. It was a male domain, top to bottom, a place of spitting and shouting and sawdust on the floor to soak up whatever ended up there. A respectable woman simply did not enter. To be seen in a saloon was to have your reputation quietly ruined. The line was absolute, and everybody understood it without a word being spoken. The speakeasy erases that line almost by accident. When a business is already breaking the law by existing, it has very little reason to enforce the old social rules on top of that. It needs customers, paying customers, as many as it can safely fit behind its locked door. And half the population it previously turned away happens to have money and a thirst. Suddenly, the exclusion that seemed eternal looks less like a principle, and more like a habit nobody can afford anymore. So the doors open, and in the women come. Not as a scandal, not as a spectacle, but simply as customers, ordering drinks and sitting at tables and enjoying a night out exactly as the men do. Because the entire establishment is already outside the law, there is no reputation left to protect. When everyone in the room is technically a criminal, the old distinctions about who is respectable and who is not begin to lose their grip. This lands right in the middle of an era already remaking what a woman is allowed to be. This is the age of shorter hair and shorter hemlines, of a new and bolder public presence. The young woman of the moment steps into the speakeasy as part of a much larger claiming of space, and the hidden bar becomes one of the stages on which that change plays out, drink in hand, entirely unbothered by the disapproval of an older world. And here sits the irony, so thick you could serve it with a twist of peel. Much of the energy behind Prohibition in the first place came from women's organisations, who saw drink as a destroyer of homes and families and campaigned hard to have it banned. Their goal was to protect the domestic sphere by getting rid of the saloon. And the law they helped pass did indeed kill the saloon. It then replaced it with the speakeasy, which promptly welcomed women inside for the very first time. You could not have designed a more perfect backfire if you tried. The reformers set out to pull people away from public drinking and toward the safety of the home. Instead, they demolished the one drinking establishment that had always excluded women and handed them a brand new kind that did not. The law meant to shrink the world of drink, accidentally expanded it to include an entire half of the population it had never reached before. You watch a woman at the next table lift her coupe glass and take an unhurried sip, entirely at ease, and you understand that something has changed here that no repeal will ever undo. The door, once opened, does not close again. All this illegal drinking requires an illegal supply, and a whole shadow economy rises to meet the demand. Out at sea, rum runners load fast boats with liquor from the Caribbean and Canada, racing to shore under cover of darkness while the Coast Guard gives chase. On land, bootleggers move the goods in hidden compartments, false-bottomed trucks, and the occasional hollowed-out egg. The word bootlegger comes from the old habit of hiding a flask in the leg of your boot, and now an entire industry proudly wears that name. You do not ask where your drink came from. You've learned that certain questions are bad for everyone's health. Every drink you swallow has travelled a secret road to reach you, and the beginning of that road is often the sea. Liquor is perfectly legal just across the borders, in Canada to the north, and the islands of the Caribbean to the south, which means the only real challenge is getting it from there to here without being caught. This turns out to be a challenge that a great many bold and greedy people are eager to accept. The rum runners are the sailors of this shadow trade, and they are a particular breed. They load their boats with legal foreign liquor, wait for darkness, and run for the American coast at speed, hoping to slip their cargo ashore before anyone official notices. The Coast Guard patrols against them, and the result is a genuine and ongoing chase played out on the black water at night. Fast boats against fast boats, with a fortune in bottles as the prize. Some of the cleverer operators park larger ships just outside the legal boundary offshore, forming what people take to calling Rum Row, a floating liquor market bobbing at the edge of the law. Smaller, faster boats zip out from shore, buy their load, and dash back in. It is a whole maritime economy conducted almost entirely in the dark, its account books written in nerve and its wages paid in risk. Once the liquor reaches land, the bootleggers take over, and their ingenuity is a wonder to behold. They build hidden compartments into everything that moves. Trucks with false bottoms, cars with secret tanks. Any hollow space large enough to hold a bottle becomes a candidate for smuggling. The stories of concealment grow ever more inventive, until it seems there is no object so ordinary that someone has not tried to hide booze inside it. The name they carry is a small piece of history all its own. Long before Prohibition, a bootlegger was simply someone who hid a flask of liquor down the leg of his tall boot to sneak it where it was not allowed. The word was a minor bit of slang for a minor bit of mischief. Now it swells to describe an entire national industry of smugglers and suppliers, worn without shame, a humble old term promoted to describe one of the great criminal enterprises of the age. And you, the ordinary drinker at the end of this long secret chain, learn the single most important rule of the whole arrangement, which is not to ask about it. You do not inquire where your gin was made or how your whiskey reached the city, or whose fast boat carried it in the dark. Curiosity, in this business, is unhealthy for everyone involved, most especially you. The supply arrives, the price is paid, and the details remain politely fogged. It is a strange thing to have your simple evening drink connected by an invisible thread to smugglers on the midnight sea and criminals with false-bottomed trucks. But that is the machinery Prohibition built. Ban the legal supply, and an illegal one rises to replace it, faster and darker and answerable to no one, delivering your drink to your hand and asking only that you never wonder how. When you outlaw something that millions of people still want, you do not end the trade. You simply hand it to whoever is most willing to break the law, and those people turn out to be very organized indeed. Criminal gangs, once small and scattered, grow rich and powerful on the flood of booze money, none more famous than a Chicago man named Al Capone, who reportedly earns tens of millions of dollars a year supplying the thirsty. The violence that follows is real and grim, and the streets pay for it in blood. Prohibition was meant to reduce crime. Instead, it accidentally funds a criminal empire. The economic logic here is brutally simple, and the lawmakers somehow missed it entirely. A product that millions of people want does not stop being wanted just because it is banned. The demand remains, enormous and constant. All the ban does is remove the legal businesses that used to satisfy that demand, leaving a vast and hugely profitable market with no one to serve it. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so, it turns out, does crime. Into that vacuum step the people least troubled by the law, and they discover a river of money flowing straight to them. What had been small-time criminal outfits, scattered and squabbling, suddenly have access to a revenue stream beyond anything they ever imagined. Booze money pours in by the truckload, and with that money comes the power to organize, to expand, to buy influence, and to crush anyone who stands in the way. Petty gangs grow into genuine empires. The most famous face of it all is a Chicago figure named Al Capone, who becomes something close to a household name. He runs a vast operation supplying illegal liquor across the city and reportedly pulls in tens of millions of dollars a year doing it. He's at once a criminal and a celebrity, feared and photographed, a man who has grown monstrously rich on a business that exists only because the government created the conditions for it to thrive. But the money is only half the story, and the other half is written in blood. When a wildly profitable trade operates entirely outside the law, there is no court to settle disputes, no contract to enforce a deal, no police to call when a rival moves in on your territory. So the gangs settle things the only way left to them, with violence, and the competition for control of the liquor trade turns city streets into battlegrounds, with a regularity that horrifies the public. You feel the grimness of it settle over the era like a shadow. The passwords and the clever cocktails and the daiquiris in Havana are one side of Prohibition, the light and playful side. This is the other side, the dark one, where the same law that gave you a fun evening also handed fortunes and firepower to violent men and turned neighborhoods into shooting galleries. The two sides belong to the same story, and you cannot honestly tell one without the other. The crowning irony, and this era produces irony the way it stills produced gin, is what the law was supposed to accomplish. Prohibition was sold in part as a way to reduce crime, to build a more orderly and law-abiding society by removing the corrupting influence of drink. Instead, it did the precise opposite. It manufactured a brand new category of crime, funded it lavishly and armed it, creating criminal organizations more powerful than anything that had existed before the ban. You order your drink from a supply chain you know better than to question, and somewhere at the top of that chain sits a man growing rich and dangerous on your thirst. The law did not clean up the country. It simply decided who would profit from its worst habits, and then made sure they had plenty of money and every reason to fight over it. One of the more wonderful loopholes runs straight through your friendly neighborhood physician. Medicinal whiskey remains perfectly legal, available by prescription for a startling range of ailments, and doctors across the country discover a sudden epidemic of patients who require exactly 1 pint of whiskey every 10 days. You visit the doctor, describe some vague complaint, and stroll out with a prescription you fill at the pharmacy. One drugstore chain in particular balloons from a couple dozen shops into hundreds during these years, and while they will always insist it was the milkshakes that did it, you have your quiet suspicions. The loophole exists because the medicine of the age still took whiskey seriously as a remedy. For generations, alcohol had been prescribed for all manner of complaints, and that belief did not vanish simply because a new law arrived. So the ban carved out an exception, permitting doctors to prescribe medicinal liquor to patients who needed it. The trouble, of course, is that need turns out to be a wonderfully flexible concept once a thirsty nation gets involved. The pretense is threadbare and everyone agrees not to notice. A patient arrives complaining of some vague and unverifiable ailment, fatigue perhaps, or nerves, or a persistent something that whiskey has traditionally been thought to soothe. The doctor, nodding gravely, writes out a prescription. The patient carries it to the pharmacy and exchanges it for a legal bottle. No one in this transaction believes for a moment that it is truly about health, and no one says so because saying so would spoil a very comfortable arrangement. The standard dose becomes a small national joke, a pint of whiskey to be taken over the course of 10 days, refillable as symptoms require. And symptoms, remarkably, always seem to require. The illness that demands medicinal whiskey proves to be one of the most persistent conditions in medical history, flaring up again reliably every 10 days in patients who otherwise appear the picture of health. It is a miracle the medical journals somehow never got around to studying. For the doctors, it is a tidy bit of extra income, a fee for each prescription written. For the pharmacies, it is a bonanza. The drugstore, already a legal seller of many things, becomes one of the few legal gateways to a drink, and business is very, very good. One chain in particular seizes the moment and expands with startling speed, growing from a modest handful of shops into a sprawling empire of hundreds during the dry years, a rise that the company would ever after prefer to credit to its ice cream counter. And perhaps the milkshakes really were excellent, but you have watched the steady traffic of perfectly healthy-looking customers filing in with their vague complaints and filing out with their neatly wrapped bottles, and you have drawn your own conclusions. Ever seen an entire nation develop the same mysterious ailment at once, cured only by a specific brand of whiskey available by prescription? It strains the medical imagination. The whole arrangement is a small masterpiece of a national self-deception, and everyone plays their part with a straight face. The lawmakers can say they banned drinking. The doctors can say they treated the sick. The pharmacies can say they filled prescriptions. And you can say you were simply following medical advice as you carry your legal pint home. Every link in the chain has its excuse ready, polished, and entirely unbelievable. It is one of the gentler ironies of the era, more comedy than tragedy, a reminder that where there is a strong enough thirst and a wide enough loophole, human ingenuity will happily meet in the middle. You did not break the law. You simply developed a chronic condition at 10-day intervals that only whiskey could treat. Get well soon. If medicine will not save your evening, perhaps religion will. Sacramental wine used in church ceremonies is exempt from the ban, and what follows is a genuine miracle, a sudden and dramatic surge in religious devotion across the nation. Enrollment in congregations swells. Wine shipments to houses of worship climb to levels that would require truly heroic amounts of praying to consume honestly. New congregations appear with suspicious speed and even more suspicious wine orders. You do not need to be a theologian to notice that the Lord's cellar has never been better stocked, or that the faithful have never once seemed quite so cheerful. The exemption comes from a place of genuine respect. Wine plays a real and sacred role in religious ceremony, and the framers of the ban had no wish to interfere with worship. So they permitted sacramental wine to continue flowing to houses of faith for their rituals. It was a reasonable and respectful accommodation, and like every reasonable accommodation in this story, it was promptly seized upon and stretched to the very edge of absurdity. What happens next can only be described as a spiritual awakening of remarkable convenience. Across the country, people discover a deep and previously hidden hunger for religious observance. Congregations swell with new members, attendance climbs. The nation, by all outward signs, has turned its heart toward heaven with a fervour unseen in living memory, right at the exact moment that religious institutions became one of the few legal sources of wine. Truly, faith moves in mysterious ways. The wine orders tell the real story more honestly than any attendance record. Shipments to houses of worship climb to volumes that would require the faithful to be conducting ceremonies almost around the clock to use it all honestly. The arithmetic simply does not work. No ordinary congregation could ceremonially consume what some of them were ordering. Somewhere between the shipment and the sacrament, a great deal of holy wine was clearly finding a distinctly unholy destination. New congregations spring up too, appearing with a speed that would be inspiring if it were not so obviously opportunistic. Some of these fresh houses of faith seem to exist mainly on paper, their most vigorous activity being the placement of large and frequent wine orders. It becomes another of the era's open secrets, a scheme everyone can see through and few can be bothered to stop, because stopping it would mean questioning the sincerity of the faithful, and who wants to be seen doing that? You watch it all with the same weary amusement you have learned to bring to every loophole in this decade. The pattern is always the same. The law carves out a sensible exception for a genuine purpose. Human ingenuity examines that exception, finds its edges, and cheerfully drives a wagon through the middle of it. Whether the excuse is medicine or worship, the underlying truth is identical. People want a drink, and they will find a legal doorway to one wherever the law leaves the smallest gap. There is something almost tender in the sheer effort involved. To get a drink in this era, you must apparently either fall mysteriously ill every 10 days or undergo a sudden and profound religious conversion. Both require a certain commitment to the performance, a willingness to keep a straight face while everyone around you keeps theirs. The whole country becomes an ensemble cast in a play that nobody believes and everybody attends. You glance toward the well-stocked cellar of the local house of worship, fuller than it has ever been, and you offer up a small, silent observation of your own. The Lord may work in mysterious ways, but rarely have his ways been quite so conveniently aligned with the national thirst. The alcohol industry does not die quietly. It gets creative. Grape growers begin selling blocks of dried, concentrated juice called wine bricks, which arrive with a label solemnly warning the buyer not to dissolve the brick in water, add yeast, and leave it in a cool, dark cupboard for 3 weeks, because it would then, regrettably, turn into wine. Breweries pull a similar trick with malt syrup, technically sold for baking. Everyone involved understands precisely what is happening, and the warning is really an instruction manual wearing a thin disguise. It is the wink of an entire industry refusing to go down without a fight. The wine brick is one of the great comic inventions of the era, and its genius lies entirely in its packaging. The product itself is innocent enough, a solid block of dried and concentrated grape juice, perfectly legal to sell and to own. Reconstituted with water, it makes an ordinary and lawful grape drink. There is nothing criminal about a brick of grape juice. The crime, such as it is, lives entirely in the customer's intentions, and the manufacturer has thoughtfully provided those. Because printed right there on the package is a warning, and it is the most helpful warning ever written. It cautions the buyer with grave concern against a specific sequence of actions. Do not dissolve this in water. Do not add yeast. Do not store it in a cool, dark place for a period of weeks. Because if you did all of those things, in that order, the warning explains the harmless grape juice would ferment and become wine, which would of course be illegal. It is, in other words, a recipe, a complete step-by-step recipe for making wine at home, printed in the form of a stern instruction not to do it. The manufacturer has found a way to teach every customer exactly how to break the law, while technically advising them not to, and everyone involved understands the game perfectly. The buyer reads the warning not as a caution but as a manual, follows it precisely, and 3 weeks later toasts the ingenuity of the grape grower who made it all so easy. The breweries, not to be outdone, play the same trick with their own product. They sell malt syrup, a thick, concentrated extract, marketed with a straight face for baking and other wholesome domestic purposes, and it can indeed be used for baking. It can also, as any customer quickly understands, form the basis of homemade beer with the addition of a few easily obtained ingredients. The label says one thing, the sales figures say another, and the sales figures are enormous. What you're witnessing is an entire industry declining to accept its own death sentence. The grape growers and the brewers have been told their business is finished, and rather than fold, they have simply repackaged. They no longer sell wine or beer. They sell the raw materials plus a carefully worded warning that doubles as a set of instructions, and they let the customer complete the final step in the privacy of a cool, dark cupboard. Technically, they have broken no law. Practically, they are supplying the nation. The wink runs through the whole arrangement. Manufacturer, retailer, and customer are all in on it together, each maintaining the polite fiction while doing exactly what the fiction pretends to forbid. It is a conspiracy conducted in plain sight, printed on labels, sold in shops, entirely legal in the letter and entirely illegal in the spirit, which by now is the defining flavour of the entire decade. You picture the little brick sitting in its cupboard, quietly transforming itself according to instructions it was told never to follow, and you have to admire the sheer stubborn cleverness of it. You cannot kill an industry this determined. You can only give it a reason to get creative, and creativity in this country has never once been in short supply. Not every part of this story is funny, and this is the part where the laughter stops. To discourage people from drinking industrial alcohol, the government orders it deliberately poisoned, adding lethal chemicals to the very supply that bootleggers were stealing and reselling. The intention was to frighten the public into sobriety. The result was that thousands of ordinary people doing nothing more than having a drink died from it. It is a sobering reminder that beneath the passwords and the clever cocktails, this era carried a real and heavy cost, one that fell hardest on the people who could least afford anything safer. To understand how this happened, you have to follow the supply. A great deal of the illegal booze in the country was made from industrial alcohol, the kind used in manufacturing and cleaning, and countless other legitimate purposes. Bootleggers stole or diverted this alcohol in enormous quantities, cleaned it up as best they could, and sold it as drink. The government, watching this happen, decided to close the pipeline by making that industrial alcohol undrinkable. The method they chose was to require that industrial alcohol be denatured, deliberately laced with additives to make it poisonous and foul, so that no one would want to drink it. The theory was that faced with the supply that was now genuinely toxic, the bootleggers would give up and the public would sober up. It was, in the coldest sense, a deterrent, a way of using fear and danger to accomplish what the law alone had failed to. But the theory ran headlong into human nature, and human nature did not blink. The bootleggers did not give up. They simply hired their own chemist to try to remove the poison, to render the tainted alcohol drinkable again. Sometimes this worked. Often it did not, or did not work completely, and the result was liquor that still carried enough of its lethal additives to do terrible harm. The poison supply flowed on, cleaned imperfectly, sold anyway, and so people died. Not criminals for the most part, not the powerful men at the top of the trade, but ordinary drinkers, the same people who elsewhere in this story are throwing cocktail parties and swapping speakeasy passwords. They bought what they could afford, they drank it as they always had, and some of them were poisoned by a supply their own government had deliberately made deadly. The toll ran into the thousands over the course of the ban. There is no comfortable way to tell this part, and it deserves none. The bright and playful side of Prohibition, the ingenuity and the humour and the daiquiris in the sun is real, but it is not the whole truth. Underneath it ran this darker current, in which the campaign to enforce sobriety was willing to accept the deaths of ordinary citizens as a cost of the effort. The people who suffered most were rarely the wealthy, who could afford safer, imported supplies, but the poor, who took what they could get. It is worth sitting with that inequality for a moment, because it runs through the entire era. From the very first day, when the rich filled their cellars and the poor lost their saloons, Prohibition fell hardest on those with the least. The poisoned bottle is the grimmest expression of that same pattern. Safety, in the dry years, was something you could buy if you had the money, and its absence was something the poor paid for with their lives. So as this long night of history unfolds, with all its comedy and cleverness, hold on to this quieter truth as well. Beneath the fun there was real harm, born unequally, inflicted in part by the very authorities who claim to be protecting people. The cocktail was born in this era, yes, but so was a great deal of avoidable grief, and an honest telling has room for both. Descend the stairs into a good speakeasy, and the first thing that reaches you is the sound. This is the age of jazz, and the hidden clubs become its beating heart, filled with brass and rhythm and a kind of electric freedom that only exists in places that are not supposed to exist. Musicians who will one day be legends play in smoky back rooms for crowds who came with the booze and stayed for the music. The dancing is faster, the clothes are looser, and the whole culture feels like it is finally exhaling after a long-held breath. Prohibition tried to make the country quieter. It made it swing instead. The sound hits you before your eyes have even adjusted to the dim light. It comes up the stairs to meet you, a warm wall of brass and rhythm, and by the time you reach the bottom, you are already moving to it whether you meant to or not. The music is not background here. It is the whole point, the living pulse of the room, and it fills the low-ceilinged space until the air itself seems to vibrate with it. This is jazz in its wild youth, and the speakeasy is exactly the right home for it. The two things fit together perfectly because they share the same spirit, improvised and alive and a little dangerous, thriving in the spaces where the rules do not quite reach. The hidden clubs give the music a stage, and the music gives the clubs a soul, and together they create something that neither could have managed alone. The drink may have drawn the crowd, but the sound is what makes them stay. The rooms fill with smoke and heat and bodies in motion. The dancing of this era is a thing of pure energy, fast and loose and joyful, a world away from the stiff and formal steps of the generation before. Couples spin and kick and lose themselves in the rhythm. The clothes have loosened to allow it, hemlines rising, movement freeing, everything built for a body that intends to dance until it can barely stand. The whole scene crackles with a kind of released tension. Among the musicians in these smoky back rooms are talents who will one day be spoken of with awe, playing now for a few dollars in a crowd of the thirsty, honing their craft night after night in the illicit dark. The speakeasy is an accidental conservatory, a place where the new music is being invented in real time by people who have no idea that history is watching. You are hearing the future, and it is being born in a basement over the clink of illegal glasses. There is a feeling in these rooms that is hard to name and impossible to forget, a sense of a whole culture finally letting its breath go. The country outside is buttoned up, disapproving, dry by decree, but down here, behind the locked door, it comes alive, loose and loud and unashamed. The very illegality of the place seems to concentrate the joy, to make every note and every step feel like a small victory over everything grey and forbidding above. And here is the final irony of this most ironic of eras. Prohibition was meant to calm the nation, to sober it, to quiet its wilder impulses and steer it toward order and restraint. What it actually produced was this: the roar and swing of the Jazz Age, a culture louder and freer and more alive than the one it replaced. Drive pleasure underground and it does not die. It concentrates, intensifies, and comes back stronger, playing a hot brass line in a room that is not supposed to exist. You stand at the bottom of the stairs, drink in hand, the music pouring over you, and you understand that the law reached for silence and struck up a band instead. The country was told to be quiet. Instead, down in the dark it learned to swing. Out of all this chaos comes something that outlives it. A golden age of cocktail recipes we still drink today. The Sidecar, the French 75, the South Side, the Mary Pickford, named for the film star, the Bee's Knees with its honey, and dozens more take shape in this exact moment, refined in speakeasies and hotel bars from Havana to London. Each one was, in its own quiet way, a solution to the same stubborn problem: how to turn rough liquor into something you actually wanted to swallow. You're not living through a dark age of drinking at all. You're living through its strange, brilliant renaissance, and you did not even notice. Consider what a strange thing this is. An era defined by terrible booze, by bathtub gin and rushed whiskey and poison in the bottle, somehow becomes the very era that produces some of the finest cocktail recipes ever devised. It should not make sense, and yet it makes perfect sense because the awfulness of the base ingredient was precisely the pressure that forced the invention. Bad liquor was the problem. These drinks were the answer, and the answer turned out to be beautiful. Take the Sidecar, a bright marriage of brandy, orange liqueur and lemon, balanced so carefully that no single part overwhelms the others, or the French 75, which lifts gin and lemon skyward with a pour of sparkling wine and a name borrowed from an artillery piece, because the drink was said to hit with similar force. These are not crude concoctions thrown together in desperation. They are precise, considered, elegant, the work of people who cared deeply about getting the balance exactly right. The South Side brings gin together with lemon and fresh mint into something clean and cooling. The Mary Pickford, born in the bars of Havana and named for one of the great film stars of the age, weaves rum with pineapple and a whisper of cherry into a drink as glamorous as its namesake. Each of these has a story, a birthplace, a moment of creation, and each was polished to a shine in the speakeasies and hotel bars where the exiled masters and the local talents were quietly perfecting their craft. What unites every one of them is that stubborn founding problem. The liquor available was rough, and something had to be done about it. So the makers reached for citrus to brighten, for sweetness to soften, for liqueurs and bitters and sparkling wine to add depth and complexity, where the base spirit offered only harshness. What began as a rescue mission became a genuine art. They set out to make bad gin bearable, and ended up making cocktails worth travelling for. The reach of it is remarkable too. These drinks are not being invented in one city but across a scattered world, wherever the craft has taken refuge. Havana contributes its rum creations under the tropical sun. London and Paris refine their own, guided by the American exiles who fled there. The recipes travel, cross paths, influence one another, and slowly assemble into a shared vocabulary of the cocktail that will outlast the band that inspired it by a century and counting. And here is the part that should make you smile. You, living through the dry years, might reasonably assume you're enduring a dark age for drinking, a grim time of deprivation and swill. In truth, you're living through one of its great creative flowerings. The very constraints that seemed like pure hardship were forcing an explosion of invention, and the drinks born from that struggle would still be poured, admired, and enjoyed long after everyone had forgotten the terrible gin that made them necessary. You lift a beautifully balanced cocktail to your lips, unaware that you are tasting history in the making. It is a renaissance disguised as a drought, and you are right in the middle of it. The cocktail is not merely a mixture, it is a performance, and this era teaches ordinary people the entire choreography. You learn that ice matters, that a drink shaken is a different creature from a drink stirred, that the right glass makes a weak drink feel elegant and a strong one feel civilized. Garnishes appear, a twist of peel, a cherry, an olive. Tiny flourishes that whisper someone cared. In a time when the booze itself is a gamble, the ritual around it becomes a way of reclaiming a little dignity. You cannot control what is in the bottle, but you can absolutely control the presentation, and presentation, it turns out, is half the magic. You begin with ice, which turns out to be far more than frozen water. Ice chills, yes, but it also dilutes, softening a harsh drink as it slowly melts, and the amount and the timing of that melting change the drink entirely. A cocktail served over a single large piece of ice behaves differently from one poured over crushed. You learn to think about ice the way a cook thinks about heat, as an active ingredient rather than an afterthought, and your drinks improve the moment you do. Then comes the great question of shaken versus stirred, which is not mere fussiness but genuine chemistry. Shaking a drink hard against ice chills it fast, dilutes it briskly, and whips a little air into it, leaving it cold and lively and slightly clouded. Stirring is gentler, chilling and diluting more slowly, leaving the drink silky and clear. The same ingredients treated the two ways become two different creatures, and knowing which to use for which drink is the mark of someone who has truly learned the craft. The glass matters too, more than you would ever have guessed. The delicate coupe, held by its stem so your warm hand never touches the bowl, makes even a modest drink feel like an occasion. A heavy tumbler gives a strong spirit a sense of solid, civilized purpose. The right glass flatters the drink inside it, sets the mood before the first sip, and quietly tells your guest that thought has gone into their evening. It is like the difference between a gift handed over loose and one properly wrapped, and the garnishes arrive, those small final flourishes that seem trivial and are not. A twist of lemon peel, its oils expressed over the surface to release a burst of fragrance. A single cherry resting at the bottom, an olive on a pick. Each one is tiny, and each one announces that someone cared enough to finish the job properly. The garnish is a signature, a last small gesture of craft, the difference between a drink poured and a drink presented. Notice what all of this is really doing. In an era when the actual liquor is a gamble, when what is in the bottle might be rough or cloudy or worse, the ritual around the drink becomes a way of reclaiming a little control and a little dignity. You may not be able to fix the gin, but you can chill it perfectly, serve it in a lovely glass, and finish it with a graceful twist. The ceremony redeems what the ingredient cannot. That is the quiet genius of it. Presentation turns out to be very nearly half the magic. A carefully made cocktail, cold and clear in an elegant glass with a bright twist of peel, feels like a luxury even when its origins are humble, even when the base spirit came from somewhere best not asked about. The ritual dresses up the truth and, in dressing it up, somehow makes it true. You take your beautifully presented drink in hand and understand that a whole nation has learned, out of necessity, that how you serve a thing can matter as much as the thing itself. The performance has become the point, and it is a performance you now know by heart. With bartending pushed underground and into the home, the knowledge has to travel somehow, and it travels in small treasured books of recipes passed carefully hand to hand. The most famous of them is assembled by that same exiled bartender over in London, and gathers hundreds of cocktails into one elegant volume that people still reach for a century later. At home, you keep your own scribbled notes, a personal grimoire of what works and what to avoid at all costs. These humble collections quietly preserve an entire craft through the years, when practicing it openly could get you arrested. The recipes survive only because someone bothered to write them down. Think about the problem these little books are solving. A craft that once lived in the heads and hands of professional bartenders, passed down in busy bars from one worker to the next, has suddenly had its home destroyed. The saloons are closed, the professionals scattered or driven underground. If the knowledge is going to survive, it needs a new way to travel, and the way it finds is the oldest and most durable one there is. Someone writes it down. The grandest of these efforts comes from that exiled master over in London, who gathers his accumulated wisdom into a single elegant volume. Hundreds of recipes carefully recorded, each one a small preserved piece of a craft under siege back home. The book is a monument and a lifeboat at once, capturing between its covers an entire world of drink-making at the very moment that world was outlawed in the country that created it. That it is still consulted a century later tells you how well the job was done, but the great published books are only the visible tip of a vast and humble effort. All across the dry country, ordinary people are keeping records of their own. You are one of them. Somewhere you have a set of scribbled notes, a personal collection of what you've learned through trial and frequent error. This much honey, not that much. This citrus works, that one turns bitter. Shake this, stir that. It is your own private grimoire, a little book of spells for transforming bad liquor into something good. These homemade collections are precious in a way the grand volumes are not, because they are so intensely practical. They record not abstract ideals, but hard-won local truths, the particular tricks that made a particular batch of terrible gin drinkable last Saturday. They carry warnings as much as recipes, the accumulated wisdom of 100 small disasters. Avoid this, never again that. A good personal recipe book is a map of every mistake you've learned not to repeat. And the knowledge moves, hand to hand, friend to friend, in exactly the quiet way the era demands. You copy a recipe from someone whose party impressed you. You pass along your own signature drink to a friend just learning to host. The craft spreads through a web of trust and generosity, each person adding a little, refining a little, carrying the whole tradition forward one shared page at a time. It is preservation by community, the surest kind there is. There is something quietly heroic in it. This refusal to let a body of knowledge die just because the law had turned against it. Practicing the craft openly could bring arrest. So the craft went quiet, went private, went into the pages of little books kept in kitchen drawers and coat pockets, waiting for a friendlier day. The recipes did not survive by luck. They survived because people who loved them made the effort to write them down and hand them on. You add a new line to your own small book, a refinement you discovered just tonight, and you become one more link in a long chain of quiet preservation. The craft lives because you and 1,000 others refuse to let it be forgotten, one carefully written recipe at a time. Standing against this tide of thirst is an army of Prohibition agents, handed the impossible job of stopping an entire country from doing something it very much wants to do. Some are corrupt, happily pocketing bribes to look the other way. A famous pair named Izzy and Mo take the opposite approach, becoming masters of disguise, dressing as everything from grave diggers to football players to trick their way into speakeasies before springing their arrests. You watch these raids with a curious blend of fear and entertainment, because whether the agents are heroes or clowns tends to depend entirely on whether it is your bar being raided that night. Spare a thought, briefly, for the agents themselves, because their assignment borders on the absurd. They have been ordered to enforce, across an entire vast nation, a law that a huge share of that nation has no intention of obeying. There are never enough of them, never remotely enough, to police the countless speakeasies, bootleggers, and home brewers arrayed against them. It is like being handed a teaspoon and told to bail out the sea, and the sea in this case is thirsty and organised. Faced with an impossible job and modest pay, a great many agents make the arrangement that impossible jobs tend to invite. They take bribes. The speakeasy operator finds it far cheaper and simpler to pay an agent to look the other way than to risk a raid, and the agent finds the extra money hard to refuse. Corruption spreads quietly through the whole enforcement effort, until in many places the law against drink is enforced mainly on those who forgot to pay, or could not afford to. But not all of them take the easy road, and the ones who did not become legends. The most delightful are a pair named Izzy and Mo, who approach the impossible job with pure theatrical genius. Rather than kick down doors, they talk their way through them, using an endless wardrobe of disguises to blend in wherever they need to go. They pose as grave diggers, as football players, as any character the situation calls for, gaining the confidence of their targets before revealing who they really are and springing the arrest. Their success comes not from force but from performance, and they clearly relish the show. Each new disguise is a small piece of comic theatre, a con artist's trick turned to the service of the law. They understand something their more heavy-handed colleagues miss, which is that the surest way into a place that keeps out strangers is to stop being a stranger. So they become whoever they must, walk in smiling, and only afterward reveal the badge. It is enforcement as vaudeville, and it works wonderfully. For you, the ordinary drinker, the agents occupy a strange double role, and your feelings about them shift with the wind. From a comfortable distance, a clever raid is entertainment, a story to enjoy, the disguises and the surprise and the scramble all faintly ridiculous. But let the raid land on your own favourite speakeasy while you happen to be inside it, and the comedy evaporates instantly into real fear, the fear of arrest, of exposure, of a very bad night indeed. That is the whole strange truth of enforcement in these years. Whether the agent is a hero or a clown, a menace or a joke, depends almost entirely on where you happen to be standing when he appears. To the law-abiding, he is order restored. To the crowd in the raided basement, he is disaster in a disguise. And to the operator who paid him off last week, he is simply an expense that unexpectedly failed to deliver. You watch the raids from your safe distance and laugh at the costumes, and you keep, always, a quiet ear tuned toward the door of your own favourite hideaway, because the night the joke arrives at your table you would very much like a head start. For all the moral fervour behind it, Prohibition has an accountant's problem. It is wildly expensive and it earns the government nothing. The old taxes on legal liquor had quietly filled the public coffers, and now that money is simply gone, replaced by the enormous cost of trying and failing to enforce an unenforceable law. Meanwhile, the criminals grow richer, and the courts grow clogged with cases nobody can win. Slowly, even people who once cheered the ban begin doing the uncomfortable math and arriving at an unwelcome answer. The experiment is not just failing morally, it is failing on the balance sheet, and money has a way of ending arguments. Start with the money that vanished, because it was a great deal of money. Before the ban, legal liquor had been taxed, and those taxes had poured a steady and substantial river of revenue into the public treasury. It was one of the government's more reliable sources of income, quietly funding the ordinary business of the nation. The moment liquor became illegal, that entire river dried up. The drinking did not stop, but the taxes on it certainly did, and the treasury felt the loss keenly. Now add the money that had to be spent. Enforcing the ban was enormously expensive, requiring agents, courts, prisons, patrol boats, and endless effort, all aimed at a task that could not actually be accomplished. The government was pouring vast sums into the attempt to stop something it could not stop, and getting very little for its trouble. So the ledger reads badly from both directions at once. Revenue gone and costs soaring. The worst possible combination for any enterprise. The courts tell the same grim story in their own way. They become clogged, hopelessly, with an endless flood of prohibition cases, far more than they can properly handle. Each raided speakeasy, each captured bootlegger, each arrested home brewer becomes a case that must be processed, and there are simply too many. The justice system strains and slows under a burden it was never built to carry, all in pursuit of a law that generates violations faster than anyone can prosecute them. Meanwhile, the profits flow the wrong way entirely. All the money that once went to legal businesses and public taxes now flows instead to the criminals, who grow richer and more powerful by the year. The nation is, in effect, funding organised crime while starving its own treasury, a transfer of wealth from the public to the lawless that no one intended and no one can seem to stop. The arithmetic is not merely bad, it is perverse, and here is where the tide begins, quietly, to turn. People who once supported the ban out of genuine conviction start doing the sums for themselves, and the sums are hard to argue with. Even a person who dislikes drink can see that the country is spending fortunes to enforce the unenforceable, losing fortunes it used to collect, and handing fortunes to criminals in the bargain. The moral case begins to buckle under the weight of the financial one. There is a lesson in this about how great arguments actually end. Prohibition had been won on passion, on moral fervour, on stirring visions of a purer nation. But passion, it turns out, has a harder time surviving a look at the ledger. When the enthusiasm cools and the numbers come out, and the numbers are this ugly, even the faithful begin to waver. Money has a way of ending arguments that principle alone could carry on forever. You watch former supporters grow quiet, then doubtful, then openly critical, converted not by a change of heart, but by a look at the books. The experiment is failing on every front, and the balance sheet is where that failure becomes impossible to deny. The great moral crusade is being undone in the end by simple arithmetic. Prohibition was carried into law in large part by women's organisations who believed banning drink would protect families from ruin. But as the years grind on and the lawlessness deepens, a new movement of women rises to undo it, arguing that the ban has done far more damage than the drinking ever did. They organise, they campaign, and they lend the cause of repeal a respectability it badly needs. It is a remarkable reversal. The very same force that helped raise the wall now helping to pull it down, having watched their noble experiment slowly curdle into something none of them had ever intended. To feel the full weight of this reversal, you have to remember where the ban came from. Women's organisations had been among its most powerful champions, and their cause was heartfelt and serious. They'd seen the real damage that heavy drinking could do to a household, the wages lost, the families neglected, the suffering carried home from the saloon. They fought for prohibition because they believed it would protect the home, and their belief was sincere. This was no whim. It was a crusade born of genuine concern. But belief is one thing and results are another, and as the dry years drag on, the results grow harder and harder to defend. The women who fought for the ban had imagined a calmer, safer, more sober nation. What they got instead was speakeasies on every block, criminals grown rich and violent, corruption seeping through the enforcement, and poison in the cheap liquor. The medicine, they begin to see, has proven worse than the disease it was meant to cure. So a new movement rises, and it too is led by women, many of them exactly the sort who might once have supported the ban. They look clearly at what prohibition has actually produced, weigh it honestly against the drinking it replaced, and reach an uncomfortable but firm conclusion. The ban has done more harm than good. The lawlessness, the crime, the corruption, the danger, all of it outweighs whatever the original problem had been. And having reached that conclusion, they set about undoing their predecessors' great work. Their contribution to the cause of repeal is enormous, and not only in numbers. They bring organisation, energy, and above all respectability. It is one thing for the obviously thirsty to demand their drink back. It is quite another for serious, respectable women, the moral backbone of many a community, to stand up and declare that the noble experiment has failed and must end. Their voice lends the repeal movement a credibility it could not have earned on its own, and that credibility matters. There is a rare kind of courage in this that deserves to be named. It is hard to abandon a cause you once championed. It is hard to look at something you fought for and admit that it went wrong, that the results betrayed the intentions, that the honest thing now is to help tear down what you helped build. These women do exactly that. They follow the evidence rather than their pride, and they change their minds in public, which is one of the hardest things any person can do. The whole episode is a portrait of a movement watching its own creation curdle. They had wanted to save families, and instead they had helped fill the streets with crime and the bottles with poison. None of that had been the plan. So rather than cling to a failed idea out of stubbornness, they gathered themselves and worked to correct it, becoming the force for repeal as thoroughly as they had once been the force for the ban. You watch this reversal unfold and recognise it for the remarkable thing it is. The same determination that raised the wall is now, clear-eyed and unashamed, helping to pull it down. It is not defeat, it is honesty, and it is hastening the end. Then the world falls apart in an entirely different way. The stock market collapses in 1929, the Great Depression settles over everything like a cold grey fog, and suddenly the debate about prohibition looks very different. A desperate nation needs jobs, and a legal liquor industry could provide them. A broke government needs tax revenue, and legal liquor could pour it in by the millions. What was once a moral question quietly becomes a practical one, and practicality, in hard times, tends to win. The argument for keeping the country dry is drowning, not in booze, but in unemployment lines and empty treasuries. The crash changes everything, and it changes it fast. One year the country is riding high on a decade of prosperity, and the next, the stock market has collapsed, and a great economic darkness is spreading across the land. The Great Depression settles in, deep and grinding, and suddenly the concerns that occupied the nation before it look almost quaint. When people are losing their jobs, their savings, and their homes, the old debates take on an entirely new and harder edge. Into this transformed world, the question of prohibition returns wearing completely different clothes. For years, the argument has been fought mostly on moral ground, about virtue and vice, about the soul of the nation. But a starving country has little patience for abstractions. The Depression drags the whole debate down out of the clouds of morality and onto the hard concrete of practical survival. And on that ground, the case for the ban suddenly looks very weak indeed. Consider the matter of jobs first. A legal liquor industry would mean work, and work is precisely what the desperate nation is crying out for. Breweries, distilleries, bars, distributors, all the honest employment that the ban had wiped out could come roaring back to life, putting wages into empty pockets. In a time of endless unemployment lines, the promise of thousands upon thousands of new jobs is not a small thing. It is a lifeline, and everyone can see it. Then there is the matter of money, which cuts even deeper. The government, like the people it serves, is broke, its treasury drained by the Depression, at the very moment its costs are soaring. And here is legal liquor, offering to pour tax revenue back into the public coffers by the millions, the same river of income the ban had shut off years ago. A government struggling to pay its bills can hardly afford to keep refusing that money out of principle. Suddenly the ledger and the ban are pulling in opposite directions. So the whole character of the debate quietly shifts, and the shift is decisive. What had been a contest of moral visions becomes a simple question of practical benefit. Not, is drink virtuous? But rather, can the country afford to keep pretending it can do without the jobs and the taxes that legal liquor would bring? And in hard times, that second question answers itself. Practicality has a way of winning arguments that principle could have prolonged forever. The case for a dry nation, already weakened by years of visible failure, now finds itself drowning in a flood it cannot survive. Not a flood of booze, but a flood of unemployment and empty treasuries, of hardship so widespread that abstract virtue can no longer compete with concrete need. The ban had survived the ridicule and the lawlessness. It could not survive the arithmetic of a nation desperate for work and money. You watch the mood of the country turn, driven now less by thirst than by need, and you understand that the end is no longer a question of whether, but of when. The Depression did what a decade of speakeasies could not. It made repeal not merely desirable but necessary. By the early 1930s, the end feels inevitable, and the national mood shifts from fervour to fatigue. A new president campaigns on the promise of repeal, the public roars its approval, and the machinery of government begins the rare and awkward work of undoing one of its own amendments. You can feel it in the air, the way you can feel a long winter finally beginning to break. The speakeasies are still hidden, the bootleggers still busy, but everyone senses that the strange 13-year experiment is drawing to a close, and that soon you will be able to do openly what you've been doing quietly all along. The change you feel most clearly is a change of mood, and it is unmistakable. The fervour is gone. The passionate certainty that once carried the ban into law has drained away over 13 long years, replaced by a deep national weariness. People are simply tired of the lawlessness, the crime, the corruption, the hypocrisy, the whole exhausting charade. When a great crusade curdles into mere fatigue, its days are numbered, and everyone can sense that its days are now very few. Politics catches up to the mood, as politics eventually does. A new president campaigns with the promise of repeal woven into his message, offering to end the failed experiment and let the country drink again. and the public response is not quiet approval, but a roar, a great wave of relief and enthusiasm that leaves no doubt about where the nation now stands. The politicians have finally caught up with the people, and the people are more than ready to be caught up with. Then begins the strange, awkward machinery of undoing, a genuinely rare thing to witness. The ban had been written into the very Constitution itself, and unwriting it requires the same solemn, difficult process in reverse. The government must formally repeal one of its own amendments, an act so unusual it had scarcely ever been contemplated. There is something almost surreal in watching the nation carefully dismantle the great legal edifice it had so carefully built, brick by constitutional brick. Through all of this, ordinary life carries on its double existence right up to the end. The speakeasies remain hidden behind their locked doors. The bootleggers keep running their supplies. The passwords are still spoken. The peepholes still slide open. The illegal drinks are still poured in the dark. The old machinery of forbidden pleasure grinds on exactly as before, because the ban is not gone yet, only visibly dying. Habit outlasts the law that shaped it, but everyone senses what is coming, and the sense of it colours everything. There is anticipation in the air now, the particular feeling of waiting for something long, desired that is finally certainly on its way. It is like the very end of a hard winter, when the cold still bites and the snow still lies on the ground. But you can feel underneath it all the first faint loosening, the promise that the season is about to break. The drought is not over, but its ending has become inevitable. Soon, everyone understands, the strange separation of these years will simply collapse. The hidden thing will become the open thing. What you have been doing quietly, behind locked doors and past unimpressed doormen, you will soon do in the plain light of day, legally, at an ordinary bar, with no password required and no agent to fear. The two worlds, the legal and the secret, are about to become one again, and the secret one will finally be allowed to step into the light. You go on giving the knock and speaking the password for now, out of habit and necessity. But you do it with a new lightness, knowing the door will not need a password much longer. The 13-year experiment is ending, and you can feel it, the way you feel a long winter finally beginning to break. On December 5th, 1933, it is finally over. Repeal becomes law, and for the first time in 13 years you can buy a drink without a password, a prescription, or a prayer. The celebrations are enormous, though oddly the world does not descend into the drunken chaos the Crusaders had warned about for so long. People simply exhale, raise a legal glass, and get on with their lives. But something has changed permanently across those 13 years. The way the country drinks, the drinks themselves, the very idea of what a good cocktail even is, none of it will ever quite return to how it was before that first dry morning. The date deserves to be spoken plainly. December the 5th, 1933. On that day repeal becomes law, and 13 years of national thirst officially come to an end. The great experiment is finished, dismantled by the same solemn processes that created it, and the country is legally wet once more. After everything, the passwords and the bathtub gin, the raids and the rum runners, the poison and the profit, it ends not with a bang but with the quiet stroke of a pen making lawful what everyone had gone right on doing anyway. Feel the sheer simplicity of what you can now do. You can walk into a bar, an ordinary legal bar, and buy a drink. No password at the door. No unimpressed eyes at a peephole weighing whether to admit you. No vague illness invented for a sympathetic doctor. No sudden and convenient surge of religious devotion. No prayer that this particular bottle will not blind you. Just a drink, bought openly by anyone in the plain light of day. After 13 years, the ordinary has become extraordinary simply by being allowed again. The celebrations naturally are enormous, a great national exhale of relief and joy. But here is the quietly telling part, the detail that ought to have shamed the Crusaders had they been paying attention. The country does not collapse into the drunken chaos they had warned about for all those years. The dire predictions of moral ruin the moment the ban lifted simply fail to arrive. People raise a legal glass, celebrate, and then go on with their lives, behaving on the whole like the same reasonable citizens they had always been. That absence of catastrophe is its own quiet verdict on the whole endeavour. For 13 years the case for the ban had rested on the fear of what a wet nation would become, and now the nation is wet again, and it becomes, more or less, exactly what it had been before, only wearier and wiser for the detour. The monster the Crusaders had promised never shows up. People just wanted an ordinary drink, and given one legally, they took it and carried on. And yet, though the drinking returns to something like normal, the country that returns to it is not the same country that went dry. 13 years leave marks that no repeal can erase. Something has shifted permanently, deep in the culture, in ways that will outlast every memory of the ban itself. The nation that emerges from Prohibition drinks differently than the nation that entered it, and it always will. The changes are everywhere once you look. The way people drink has changed, moved from the vanished saloon into homes and cocktail parties and a whole new kind of nightlife. The drinks themselves have changed, refined during the drought into an art. And the very idea of what a good cocktail is, that has changed most of all, elevated from a minor curiosity into something people care about and take pride in. None of that returns to how it was. It cannot. The dry years reshaped it too thoroughly. You raise your first fully legal drink in 13 years and you savour not just the liquor but the strangeness of the moment, the end of one of the oddest experiments a nation ever tried on itself. It is over. But it left something behind, and that something is in the very glass in your hand. Here is the strange and wonderful truth at the end of it all. A law designed to stop people from drinking ended up transforming drinking forever. Forced to disguise terrible booze, a whole generation learned to mix, to balance, to garnish, and above all to care about what was in the glass. The cocktail, once a minor curiosity, walked out of Prohibition as a polished art form that spread around the world and never left. So the next time you hold a well-made drink with its citrus and its ice and its little twist of peel, remember that you are tasting the accidental invention of a country that tried to give up drinking and instead learned how to do it beautifully. Sit with the central irony one last time, because it really is a marvel. A law was written for the express purpose of ending drinking in America. Its entire goal was to make the nation dry, sober, and free of the whole business of alcohol. And the lasting legacy of that law was to transform drinking, to refine and elevate it, to leave the country more devoted to the art of the good drink than it had ever been before. Rarely has any effort achieved so precisely the opposite of what it set out to do. The mechanism of that transformation was the very hardship the ban imposed. Because the booze was terrible, people were forced to learn how to disguise it, and in learning to disguise it, they accidentally learned an art. A whole generation who had never given a thought to mixing drinks became, out of pure necessity, students of the craft. They learned to mix, to balance sweet against sour and strong against soft, to chill and to garnish, to care about proportion and presentation. The drought made mixologists of ordinary people, and that new care did not fade when the ban ended. The knowledge, once acquired, stayed. The cocktail, which had been a minor curiosity before the dry years, walked out of them a mature and polished art form, refined in speakeasies and exile and cocktail parties into something genuinely worthy of pride. It had been tested and improved under the hardest conditions, and it emerged the stronger for it. What the ban had meant to destroy, it had instead perfected. The reach of it circles the whole globe. Remember that the exiled bartenders carried the craft abroad, that Havana and London and Paris became laboratories of the drink during America's drought. The cocktail did not merely survive Prohibition, it went international because of it, spreading to every corner of the world and putting down roots that never pulled up. A law meant to shrink American drinking to nothing instead broadcast the American cocktail across the entire earth. So think of everything folded into a single well-made drink. The citrus that first went in to hide bad gin, the ice that a nation learned to treat as an art, the careful balance worked out at 1,000 kitchen tables, the little twist of peel, that final flourish of someone who cared. Every one of those elements is an inheritance from the dry years, a technique born of desperation and perfected into elegance. The whole history is right there in the glass if you know to look for it. That is the quiet monument this era left behind, and you hold it in your hand every time you lift a proper cocktail. Not a monument of stone, but of craft, of a way of doing something beautifully that a whole country worked out together while it was supposed to be doing nothing of the kind. The lawmakers wanted an empty glass. What they got in the end was a better one. So the next time you raise a well-made drink, cold and bright and finished with a curl of peel, offer a small silent nod to the strangest chapter in the history of the glass in your hand. A nation tried to give up drinking altogether, and instead, almost by accident, it learned how to do it beautifully. That is the legacy in your glass, and it has outlasted the ban by 100 years and counting. So there it is, the whole strange story, poured out and settled like the last inch of a well-made drink. A nation looked at its own quiet evening habit and decided to ban it completely. And what followed was 13 years of the most creative, chaotic, and thoroughly ironic law breaking anyone had ever seen. The government reached for an empty glass, and the country handed it back full, garnished, and somehow better than before. Think of everything those years contained. The mock funerals on that last legal night, the unimpressed eyes behind the peephole, the cloudy gin topped off in the bathtub, and the terrible taste that forced a whole generation to learn how to mix. The exiled bartenders sailing off with their little books of recipes. The daiquiris in Havana, 90 miles from a country that had lost its mind. The doctors and their mysteriously ill patients. The houses of worship with their overflowing cellars. The bricks that turned quietly into wine in a cool, dark cupboard. And beneath the comedy, the real cost too, the poison in the bottle and the fortunes handed to violent men, the harm that fell hardest on those who could least afford it. It is easy, from the comfort of now, to laugh at all of it, and much of it is genuinely funny. But spare a thought for the people who actually lived it. The ordinary workers who lost the warm saloon that had been their second living room. The home hosts who taught themselves an art at their own kitchen tables. The women who fought for the ban in good faith, watched it curdle, and had the rare courage to change their minds in public. They were stubborn and clever and contradictory, muddling through an experiment none of them had asked for, and out of all that muddling they left behind something that outlasted every one of them. Because that is the wonderful part. the part worth carrying with you into sleep. History is often gross and frequently absurd and sometimes genuinely tragic, but it is also proof that people are ingenious and hopeful and endlessly, gloriously determined to find a little joy wherever it has been hidden from them. Tell a whole nation it cannot have something, and it will simply learn to make that something beautiful in the dark. So tonight, as you drift off in your warm bed, in a world where a quiet drink is nobody's crime and the door needs no password, maybe raise a small silent thank you to that peculiar thirsty generation. They fumbled through their strange dry years, and without quite meaning to, they left a gift in every well-made glass. A twist of citrus, a touch of honey, a little care where there might have been none. Rest easy now. The lights are low, the fan is humming, and the long, strange night of history has, at last, gone quiet. Sleep well.